Reasonable accommodations and how to request them. What is an accommodation? How to request an accommodation? When is an accommodation reasonable? And when is the answer no to an accommodation request? An accommodation is a modification to policy or practice or the environment, the provision of a tool or a service that reduces the impact of a disability and allows the individual an opportunity to perform their job duties or to participate in programs and services. We're going to focus on performing your job duties in the workplace, but accommodations are available in education, in retail establishments, in hotels, in a variety of those contexts that are open to the public, or in government services and programs. You as an employee must trigger the accommodation process by making a request. There's no magic words you have to use, but being clear is always a good idea. So you need to make a statement that says more than "my back hurts" by the end of the day. That's a little hard to read as an accommodation request. I have a medical condition, I have an ongoing back condition, and I have difficulty with the workstation here on a regular basis. Hopefully your employer would hear as an accommodation request. But even better would be going to the right individual. It may be your supervisor, it may be somebody in human resources, and saying, I have a health condition, it affects my back, and I'm having difficulty by the end of the day sitting at my workstation, or doing the amount of walking I have to do on the job without a break, or seeing what's on my computer screen. Connecting health condition to impact that needs accommodating. And certainly if you have ideas of what would solve the problem, you're not expected to be the absolute technical expert, but as the individual, you may have a lot of good ideas for what would make it work. You may have a chair at home that is comfortable for longer periods of time, and you could say, I need a chair, something like this, as part of that accommodation request. That should trigger a discussion, not simply here's what I need, provide it, end of conversation, nor should it be a simple no from the employer, that's not something we can provide, that doesn't work for us. No, it should be an interactive conversation. If what you're requesting is unclear, they should ask for more information from you, some clarity, maybe some documentation from your doctor. If there is a reason for them to say no to your first request, they find it problematic, they should be asking, are there other ways we can accommodate you? Or potentially making suggestions about other ways to accommodate you. So an accommodation must be reasonable, it must be workable and allow you to get the job done, but it doesn't have to be the best accommodation that might be asked for. So if there are two ways to accommodate you, and one is the gold standard high-end piece of software on the computer that is artificial intelligence and pretty much does everything I ask it to, versus a piece of software that's a little less intelligent but gives me the screen enlargement and the control over the mouse that I need to effectively do my job. They can buy the cheaper software that gets the job done and don't have to buy the gold standard piece of software from me. Reasonable accommodations really are anchored to what your work is. And so they can take a variety of forms, and this list is not exhaustive, but it's an example of typical accommodations that might take place in the workplace. So it might be about modifying the environment, putting in a ramp, putting in a little more maneuvering clearance for a wheelchair, reorienting a workstation so that you're not facing a brightly lit window during the day if bright lights are a problem. A variety of those kinds of things that are about the physical environment. It might be restructuring your job duties, rearranging how they're organized, occasionally carving out a piece of the job you do and a comparable different piece of a job that some of your colleagues do, and doing some job restructuring between two jobs. So if once a month I have to travel for a day, and that's not a really central part of my job, but it's something I've always done, we might make arrangements for somebody else to take that extra day of driving if I have 4 or 5 other people doing the same kind of work as me. And I would pick up some paperwork or some telephone work or some other work that would compensate them for spending a day out on the road, that would reassign those duties. If everybody in the office takes turn once a week sitting at the reception desk during lunch and answering the phone, because the receptionist who does that normally needs to eat lunch, and I have a very strict schedule for eating that interferes with that, we might modify the timing, or perhaps somebody does 2 stints at the reception desk and I pick up some paperwork or some other work to compensate for that hour that the other person is now doing out of my job duties. So those kinds of things are possible. Modified work schedules are possible. Remember, the goal is to keep getting the work done. And so it is, in a lot of contexts, difficult to say, I need a permanent job that's part-time. But there are positions with a large enough workforce doing similar work where that's possible. But if you work part-time, you get paid part-time. Modifying your schedule, an earlier start time, a break in the middle of the day with some extra hours at the front of the day or the end of the day, or both, are all things that are quite possible in many jobs. If you work an assembly line, that might be difficult. But in most desk jobs, in most jobs, that's a fairly doable kind of accommodation. If there is no way to accommodate you within the job, you worked on that assembly line and you needed those breaks that I couldn't provide there, I might look at, was there another position that was open, that you had the skills for, that was comparable in terms of pay and shift and things like that, that I could reassign you to so that you could be accommodated. I've already talked about adaptive equipment. If there are examinations for promotion, for maintaining certification in a job, if there are those kinds of evaluations, appropriate accommodations on those. If I need, because of some cognitive impact, a little extended time or a large print version, or a version that allows me to do typing instead of handwriting to respond, those would all be reasonable accommodations on kind of workplace certification exams, training exams. Similar accommodations on training materials, provisions of somebody to read or voice output software, an ASL interpreter is a reasonable accommodation in most contexts if you had a hearing impairment. And you can, in some instances, request modifications, extensions of leave that might interact with the Family Medical Leave Act. And we'll talk about the Family Medical Leave Act in another section of this presentation. The accommodation is not always reasonable. So when the answer is no, when you've gone through that interactive process with your employer, they might point to an undue burden. It might be about the cost of the accommodation. That would have to be substantial. It would have to be compared to the overall budget of the employer, not just the one division you work in, not just the one office you work in. But if there are substantial costs that would impact the ability of the employer to continue to do business effectively, that may be an undue hardship. That standard is much higher for government employers than it is for private employers, as a rule. And it's higher for larger employers than it is for smaller employers. So there's no value set on that cost. It is an analysis of the situation and the context. More likely than cost being a reason to say no is it impacts your ability to do business as an employer. It disrupts the business flow. It significantly impacts productivity. It significantly impacts getting the essential parts of the job done. That would be another type of hardship that would be a legitimate answer to no. And as we've said a number of times, if the request you asked for, let's say for the sake of argument, was 3 months of additional unpaid leave as an accommodation beyond any other leave you might be entitled to under family medical leave or earned leave policies or medical leave policies or vacation policies, the employer might say, we can't make that work in terms of its impact on our workflow, but is there something else that would help? Could you do 50% of your job as telework from home? And would that allow us to be able to accommodate you and extend partial leave for another 3 months? And would that allow you to be able to work effectively? So that kind of conversation would need to take place. So that's exploring alternative accommodations. We've already mentioned in the last slide reassignment to a vacant position where you could get the job done and get accommodated at the same time. You might explore family medical leave as an alternative to accommodations. If you are at an employer large enough, 50 employees, to be covered by family medical leave, and you've worked there long enough to have coverage. And again, there is another resource on family medical leave later in the program. And it may mean that you start a job search for another position in another company that would allow you to get the job done and meet your needs in terms of accommodations, or just simply a job that doesn't interact with your disability, your impact, the same way.